This video is on slavery in colonial America. Its purpose is to provide a backstory, um, to discuss slavery in the United States before the period that we'll be reading about. Your readings are on the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War that starts around 1840 and then goes into the 1860s. The video is going to start back, we'll discuss the United States or the colonial America, 1600s, but it even makes some comments about slavery outside of the United States, kind of to give just some background information. Its purpose, the video's purpose is not to replace the reading. Um, if you were to just watch this video and not do the reading, you would not be prepared for the discussions at all. So please don't try to use this video to replace doing your readings. From the beginning of the American colonies, they were dependent on forced labor. And by the early 18th century, chattel slavery, which was legal in all 13 colonies, had become the dominant labor force in the southern colonies. Most of the founding fathers of the United States of America and 8 of its first 12 presidents were large-scale slave owners. Because of this situation, a question we might want to consider in one of our class discussions is, was America conceived in liberty? I suppose how one answers this question depends at least partially upon when you believe the conception of America took place. Before we delve into American slavery, first let us consider the existence of forced labor in America and in a broader world context. For example, until the 19th century, forced labor of one kind or another, slavery, serfdom, indentured servitude, peonage, was the lot of much of humanity. In other words, before the 1800s, life for many, if not most people, depending on where you lived, basically sucked and then you died. Unlike the Americas, where slavery was primarily connected to agricultural work, in other parts of the world, in addition to agricultural labor, slaves served as warriors, government officials, tutors, eunuchs, and victims of ritual sacrifice. Therefore, the answer to the question, were the living conditions for the slave in America better or worse than that of the slave in the ancient world is, it all depends. The American slave's life is probably much better than the life of a Roman galley slave or slave that worked in the mines. On the other hand, the American slave's life is probably not as good as the ancient slave who served as a government official or a tutor for some aristocrat's kid. Before the transatlantic slave trade, attempts were made to enslave Indians, which did not work out very well for several reasons. One, the men among the natives refused to work the fields because in their culture that was considered women's work. Two, they were more familiar with the land and there were not enough of them to fill the demand for the plantation labor. I guess that would be two and three. Um, a more common and for a time a more successful form of forced labor was indentured servitude. This consisted of Europeans desiring to come to America but unable to afford passage, selling themselves into temporary servitude/slavery in exchange for a free transatlantic transport. In other words, they couldn't afford to come to America, so they agreed that if a family paid for them to, or a company paid for them to come to the Americas, they would then serve as a slave or servant for that family or that company for 4 to 5 years if they were an adult and 7 years if they were a child. So it wasn't permanent like chattel slavery is going to be. The Atlantic slave trade, also known as the transatlantic slave trade, was the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas to be enslaved. This horrific system, spanning from the 16th to the 19th centuries, involved the kidnapping, forced shipment, and sale of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean, primarily to work on plantations and in other industries in the Americas. And as you can see here on the screen, there is see what we call the triangle trade, because we have interactions between um, Europe, which at this point is Britain, going to Africa and going to the Americas. And yeah, you guys can read this and see that certain products are going from certain places. And yeah, we'll go on to the next slide. So we
Oh, Babanja, belong à la paix. Can you bad na? Ow! Sembe. Apa velo?
Dios te bendice, hijo. Dios te bendice. Dios os perdona y os ama a todos. Ala, que Dios os perdona. la autorista muy ferma. Esta tampoco no le das nada. No me toques. Estas sí están bien. Mira. Tampoco esta tampoco nada. Este está enfermo, no le des nada. Dales comida solo los que están sanos. Esto sí, sí. ¡Esta! ¡Esta no! ¡Esta! ¡Esta no! ¡Esta no! ¡Adelante! ¡Una esta! Habla.
Ouvre-la plat!
¡Caminen!
¡Muévense! ¡Muévense adelante! ¡Sigan!
¡No paren!
1300. ¿Está todo bien?
Sí, todo bien.
Pode. Pode.
Comment ça, combien? 27万。帮我来老板办。
¡Señores! ¡Saludables! ¡Fuertes! ¡Siempre soy yo! ¡Soy yo! ¡Es ¡Vamos, señores! ¡Aquí queremos paz! ¡Cualquiera
Es así porque me dijeron que es demonio. Demonio. Oh, sí, lo conozco. Lo conozco.
Tenemos poco tiempo. Negro jirafa. Vamos, que tenemos poco tiempo. Negro borbosa. Flaco alto. Otro flaco. Sigue abajo. Negro Bernardo.
Bernardo.
Abajo, todos abajo.
The first Africans in British North America arrived in August of 1619 and part of a group of 19 individuals who were forcibly brought to the colony of Jamestown on the English privateer ship White Lion, which was under a Dutch contract and flying a Dutch flag after being captured from a Portuguese slave ship. So the British basically hire some pirates. That's what a privateer is. A privateer is a pirate who's serving a government. The British hired Dutch pirates to go and steal a ship from the Portuguese and the cargo off that ship, which was these Africans. And then they brought these Africans to Jamestown, essentially what happened. These Africans were traded to the colonists in exchange for supplies. These first Africans in English North America were initially treated as indentured servants, not slaves. Although there's some debate on that, there's some who want to say that they're slaves, but the evidence seems to lean. We don't know definitively. Make that point. We do not know definitively whether these were slaves or whether these were indentured servants. What we do know definitively is that they didn't volunteer to come. They were brought here against their will. While the transatlantic slave trade had already been ongoing for decades, the initial status of these individuals upon arrival in the English colony was, we think, most likely indentured servants, like many European immigrants at the time. However, the situation quickly evolved, and by the mid-17th century, laws began to codify the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. The black and white servants of the 17th century seemed unconcerned about racial differences. They worked together in the fields and socialized during leisure hours. Distinctions based on race evolved over time. No specific date marks the legal establishment of chattel slavery in the South. Slavery does not become the dominant form of labor in English America until the 1680s. Slave codes were first established in Maryland and Virginia in the 1660s, which made enslavement a permanent status for Africans in America. The status of the mother was passed on to the child. They have the status of chattel, which is basically property, like a farm animal, and instituted the one drop rule, meaning that if you had any black ancestry, you were considered uh, black and therefore subject to enslavement. And this is basically and the thing about passing the status of the mother basically allows the enslaver um, to, I'm trying to think how to put this delicately, to be involved sexually with female slaves and then be able to not take responsibility for their own children and just have them, slaves. Um, yeah, it was a very horrible institution. Christian baptism did not change the status of of slave status either. Um, Whereas in the Islamic world, if the slave became a Muslim, then they were no longer slave, because in Islam they didn't believe in enslaving other Muslims. Most slaves in America were from the West Africa. 10 to 11 million Africans were brought to the Americas, 85% of whom went to Brazil and the Caribbean. 6%, approximately 600,000, went to what today would be the United States. Tobacco was the dominant crop in the upper South on the plantations, and rice in the lower South. Sugar was the dominant crop in the Caribbean, as well as Brazil. Also, in Brazil, we have coffee. Slaves in West Africa usually lived with the immediate. So these are the differences between slavery in Africa and chattel slavery in the Americas. Slaves in West Africa usually lived with the immediate households of their owners in an environment that was not altogether foreign to them. They, and especially their children, could hope gradually to lose their marginal status and be absorbed into the families and society of their masters. By, by contrast, Africans destined for the Americas lost everything they knew, possessions, home, loved ones, and embarked on a strange new life in an alien world. The Dunmore Proclamation, which was issued in November of now we're talking about slavery during the American Revolutionary War, by the way. So the Dunmore Proclamation, which was issued in November of 1775 by Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, offered freedom to enslaved people and indentured servants who would leave their patriot owners and join the British forces. This controversial decree aimed to bolster the British war effort by exploiting the tensions surrounding slavery in the colonies and creating a loyalist army. This resulted in thousands of slaves enlisting in the British Army to fight their former masters. The proclamation was met with outrage and resistance from American colonists who feared slave revolts. Initially, George Washington was opposed to allowing black troops into the Continental Army, but eventually he gave in to pressure to reverse his decision after Dunmore's proclamation led to thousands going to the British Army. So the United States Constitution indirectly promotes slavery. The Constitution did not use the word slave, but clauses like the Three-Fifths Compromise, counting slaves as three-fifths of a person for representation in Congress, the Slave Trade Clause allowing the importation of slaves until 1808, and the Fugitive Slave Clause requiring the return of escaped slaves, all serve to protect and promote the institution of slavery. Regarding the Three-Fifths Clause, or the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Southerners wanted to count their slaves, as people entirely, um, for the purposes of the Southern states' representation in Congress. So the House of Representatives, um, the number of representatives in the House of Representatives that each state gets is dependent on the population of that state. For that reason, if you look at the amount of representatives in today's Congress, today's House of Representatives, you'll see that California has the largest amount of representatives in the House of Representatives because California has more people than any other state. And so the southern slave states wanted to take advantage of their slaves, counting them as people for the purposes of getting representation for them meaning the Virginians or the Georgians or the South Carolinians or whatnot for Congress, even though legally their slaves are counted as property, like farm animals, not like people at all. So this was very hypocritical on the part of these Southerners, and the Northerners who who had um, passed laws ending slavery in the North over time. It wasn't one of those things where we end slavery today and all slaves are free tomorrow. It was we end slavery and over time it's phased out. And by the early 1800s, it was totally done in the North. And so these Northerners were like, you guys are hypocrites. We're not going to count. You don't get to, you count them legally as property. And now for your benefits, you want to count them as people so you can get more people in the house. We don't think so. And then so in the North and the South, they argued over it, and eventually they came to a compromise. Said, okay, we won't count them as entirely as people. We'll count them as three-fifths of a person. All right, so that's how that worked. Early opposition and resistance to slavery. Virtually no whites questioned the moral basis for slavery at the beginning of the 18th century. However, by the end of the century, Quakers and some Enlightenment thinkers were speaking out against slavery. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, influenced by Quakers, served as president of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Organization that submitted a petition to Congress admonishing them to take up the issue of slavery. Slave revolts in Haiti terrified white Southerners. Failed slave revolts of Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner further concerned white Southerners. The Vesey and Prosser slave revolts actually were brought to a halt before they really began. Some people, some slaves actually told on them. Nat Turner's revolt actually occurred, and I think it was 31 or some. There's a number in the 30s, I believe. Number of whites, slave masters and their kids and their families were killed. Um, and then it lasted. It didn't last all that long. The Nat Turner one. It was in 1831. Turner and his accomplices were killed, and it struck fear into the heart of the South. It led to southern slave states banning knives and metal forks and certain tools and stuff for slaves to have access to. And it stepped up patrols. Um, Things got a lot more strict after that Turner slave revolt. The sad reality is that our nation's founding leaders failed to do anything to end slavery nationwide. Slavery did end in the North, as I said before, shortly after the Revolutionary War. However, men like Washington and Jefferson made it clear via their correspondence that they believed slavery was wrong, but they lacked the will to act and assume the institution would wither away over time, which it very well might have had it not been for Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. Um, let's speak a little about Washington. George Washington missed an opportunity to really be um, quite possibly, arguably, the greatest leader of all time. He was a great leader. He was a great leader of men. He was not a great general. He was outfoxed, out strategized on the battlefield during the Revolutionary War quite a bit. So he was not a great general, but he was a great leader of men. Could have been greater. John Laurens came up with a proposal that he approached Washington about during the Revolutionary War of freeing all slaves and just having the Revolutionary War being an opportunity to totally have a reset where America becomes the American colonies become a free nation, the slaves become free people, and we all become one as a country. And he came to Washington with this proposal um, because he thought, okay, he came to Washington saying, General, you're the only one in our colonies who has the respect of everyone, that if you back this plan, people will go along with it. Washington refused. We don't know why. We don't know if it was cowardice. We don't know if it was him not wanting to give up his free labor. But Lawrence wanted to end slavery, give the formerly enslaved people a plot of land for them to work. And likewise, Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, who was a very young man, like Hamilton, and kind of looked up to Washington like almost like a father figure. He was very instrumental in getting the French to side with the American colonies. And then after the war, after the Constitution, after the United States becomes a nation with Washington as president in the 1780s, Lafayette comes back. He visits and he sees that slavery is still going on, and he proposed to Washington again to end slavery and to go in with him to give these men and women their own land. He proposed certain areas, I think it was in South America, for them to have their own land. Um, Washington, again, did not go along with it. And Lafayette um, verbalized great disappointment in General Washington. In fact, he said that had he realized that the American colonies that would become the United States of America um, was going to just continue slavery, he would not have helped them get the support of France in the war if he had known they were going to do that. Um, this information is coming from Chernow. Ron Chernow did an excellent biography of George Washington, and I'm getting this information from that biography. And let's see. Okay. So the training of slaves. Now, why is it that one slave master can stand in the middle of several enslaved men and not fear for their safety? Not fear that these enslaved men are going to beat them to death. It's because of a certain type of psychological training, or I should say psychological conditioning. A wise master did not take seriously the belief that blacks were natural-born slaves. He knew better. He knew that Africans imported into America had to be broken into bondage, that each succeeding generation had to be carefully supervised, how enslaved people were broken in, what made it possible for one white man to stand amid several slaves without fear, and in fact, being feared, the training of slaves. And these are these principles that I got from a book by Kenneth Stamp that was written back in the 1950s called The Peculiar Institution. And the first principle was they must obey at all times and under all circumstances. You establish and maintain strict discipline. That's number one. Number two, you implant in the bondsmen themselves a consciousness of personal inferiority. They had to know and keep their place to feel the difference between master and slave. They needed to understand that bondage was their natural status. They needed to be in awe and have a sense of their master's enormous power. You needed to rule by fear. And then fourth, you had to train them to take an interest in their master's enterprise and to accept his standards of good conduct. You wanted the slave to be just as interested in what you're doing and what your plans are as you are. You don't want them to have plans for themselves, to have a sense of individuality. And then fifth, you want to impress the slave with their helplessness, to create in them a habit of perfect dependence upon their masters.